I discovered my family barred me from Thanksgiving dinner through a live internet broadcast. My younger sister stood in the heart of my parents' kitchen, swirling a glass of Chardonnay while amusement danced in her eyes as the chat feed scrolled. The lens panned across the mahogany dining table, highlighting my mother's elaborate floral arrangement while my father carved the turkey without a second thought. When someone in the comments asked about my absence, my sister scoffed and remarked that my unstable presence would only agitate her fragile miniature poodle. My mother chuckled softly in the background while my father kept quiet, completely validating the public humiliation. I stared at the glowing display, paralyzed not by the fabrication itself but by the heavy truth underneath it. They viewed me as an embarrassment because I chose a modest apartment and a demanding career instead of groveling for their financial assistance. An hour later, a text arrived from my father demanding the monthly rent payment for the suburban property they occupied, which was registered under a corporate trust I managed. Instead of retaliating with an angry message, I maintained absolute silence because quiet confidence always carries more weight than a screaming match. When I unlatched their front door unannounced the following weekend, the sheer panic on their faces proved they never saw it coming. My mother froze mid-step, nearly spilling her wine, while my father fumbled with the television remote control. My sister sat motionless on the rug beside her dog, looking at me as if a phantom had suddenly materialized in the middle of her living room. The poodle they claimed was terrified of my negative energy did not bark or flinch at all. He simply blinked up at me with calm curiosity. My sister cleared her throat nervously, demanding to know why I had shown up without a warning. Ignoring her entirely, I fixed my gaze on my father, the man who happily excluded me from the family holiday while expecting my hard-earned cash. I announced that we needed to discuss business, causing his jaw to clench tightly as he insisted it was an inconvenient time. I smiled inwardly, remembering how convenient it always was when my financial transfer cleared their bank account every single month. My mother smoothed her blouse, lecturing me about how I should have called to request permission before entering the property. I reached into my leather tote bag deliberately, watching their anxious eyes track my hand because they had no idea what transpired while they ignored me. I slid a thick manila envelope onto the glass coffee table, and they stared at it as if it contained an explosive device. When my father asked what the paperwork meant, I explained that it was the deed and lease agreement for this exact property. My sister offered a forced chuckle, noting that everyone already knew I handled the monthly housing expenses. I shook my head, clarifying that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted, and pushed the pages closer to my father. His eyes scanned the legal paragraphs, his face growing pale before my mother leaned over his shoulder and whispered a question about what I had done. I locked eyes with her and stated clearly that I bought the residential property from the master landlord 3 days prior. The room became suffocatingly quiet as my father shook his head, claiming such a transaction was completely impossible without his knowledge. I reminded him that the primary owner wanted a swift liquidation, and since I already held the primary lease, I made a competitive cash offer. My sister lunged to her feet, shouting that I could not do this, but the finalized government stamps proved otherwise. My father sank heavily into his armchair, muttering that the system did not operate this way, but I countered that the titles were officially transferred. My mother snatched the documents, reading the lines frantically as if her sheer disbelief could magically reverse the legal reality. She accused me of plotting against them behind their backs, which was ironic considering they publicly erased me from their lives just days prior. My sister sneered, asking if I enjoyed playing the role of a cruel slumlord over a simple misunderstanding. I allowed the heavy silence to linger in the room, forcing them to digest the total shift in power before nodding in confirmation. My father rubbed his temples, suddenly invoking the concept of family, which was the exact word they used to justify treating me like an outcast. I agreed that family mattered, which was precisely why I would refrain from recording their humiliation and posting it online for strangers to mock. However, I calmly informed them that their current tenancy agreement would officially terminate in exactly 30 days. My mother gasped loudly, asking if I was truly insane, but my expression remained completely serious as I watched her processing the news. This move was never fueled by petty revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my boundaries, and my future. My father tried to call my bluff, insisting his own child would never evict him because he still believed I was the same compliant girl. I told him I was not actively punishing them, But the lease was expiring, and their next destination was entirely their responsibility. My sister rolled her eyes, accusing me of throwing a massive tantrum over a harmless holiday joke. I reminded her that nobody was laughing on my side of the screen while I sat alone in the dark on Thanksgiving night. My mother stepped forward, her voice trembling as she asked where they were supposed to live on such short notice. I mirrored the exact phrase they gave me years ago, telling them they would simply have to figure it out on their own. My father stood tall, shouting that they were my flesh and blood, but I corrected him by stating I used to be his daughter. The silence that followed was absolute, and for the first time in my life, I was drawing the boundaries instead of begging for a seat. The frantic phone calls commenced early the next morning, but I ignored every ring because my actions had already communicated everything. My sister messaged me, complaining about social embarrassment, but I simply finalized the utility transfers without typing a single response. A week prior to the move-out deadline, I returned to the property using my newly minted brass key, stepping inside as the rightful owner. They were gathered in the sitting room amidst half-packed cardboard boxes, looking vulnerable without their usual arrogance. I placed the formal vacating notice on the counter, prompting my father to read it with shaking hands before asking if I would truly force them out. I held his gaze, reminding him that they had already evicted me from their hearts a long time ago. The remaining days dissolved quietly without further screaming matches, leaving only the hollow echo of packing tape and shuffling boxes. On the final morning, I stood by the threshold as the movers loaded the last of their belongings into a cargo truck. My mother avoided my gaze entirely, while my father stopped beside me, looking visibly exhausted by the reality of his new situation. He admitted he never believed I would possess the strength to follow through, and I simply nodded as he walked away. When the heavy front door clicked shut, the space finally felt peaceful, honest, and entirely disconnected from their conditional affection. I walked through the empty rooms, realizing the layout remained identical, but the internal power dynamic had changed forever. My phone vibrated with a brief text from my father stating that they missed me, but I left it unread on the screen. This journey was never about earning their longing. It was about finally commanding their respect.